Hello my dear friends, hope you are all doing great. I am back with this series. Now let's start our story. Are you pregnant? At his words, Diana lifted her head. Tears welled up at the corners of her reddened eyes, and soon they flowed down her cheeks, dropping softly. She laughed while crying, and Lennox's eyes turned red as well, mirroring her tears. Is it true? You are carrying a child? She replied. Based on the symptoms, it's highly likely that I am pregnant, one of the doctors told me. And, with current medical technology, doctors cannot confirm early pregnancy in expectant mothers. They can only make an initial diagnosis based on the symptoms. Lennox, who had been wearing an expression of intense anger, softened slightly upon hearing her words and leaned toward Diana. The attending physicians took turns observing the siblings before leaving with a warning to be careful. As soon as they were gone, Lennox grasped Diana's hand with tears of joy in his eyes. You did well, Diana, Lennox said, holding her hand tightly. Diana, with tears in her eyes, held onto his hand as well. When one of the physicians examining her mentioned the possibility of pregnancy, Diana wondered if this could be a dream. She continued, all the recent signs of loss of appetite, missed menstrual cycle, persistent queasiness, and mood swings seemed to align with early pregnancy symptoms, and suddenly, my lower abdomen felt heavy. Lennox stared at Diana's belly, which was still relatively flat, but held their savior inside. Lennox spoke. Was this what you've been waiting for all this time, to appear like a savior in such a crucial moment? Savior. This baby was their savior. Lennox's sky-blue eyes sparkled as he gazed at Diane. He then spoke. Your Highness, from now on, please take good care of yourself and the baby. Don't worry about any disturbances from outside, no matter what happens, all right? And now, all you must do now is rest and pray that the child will be a boy. She replied, yes, brother. Both the siblings thought it was the gates of hell, but when they opened, there was paradise. She thought you must be a boy, my child. They both smiled brightly. Back at the palace, Lady Giggs, who had been eyeing the sudden decision of the Empress to go out with a puzzled expression, soon objected firmly. It had been raining for a few days, and today was quite chilly for an autumn day. Moreover, the Empress had been fasting for days. But she dismissed Lady Giggs's concerns, saying she would be gone only briefly, and proceeded to pick out her own clothes from the dressing room. Lady Giggs continued to nag incessantly as she hovered around the Empress. Adele, knowing that the only way to escape this nagging was to leave quickly, moved faster, almost doubting if the person who had just risen from the sickbed was the Empress herself. Lady Giggs followed her like a shadow, almost doubting if the person had truly recovered. Lady Giggs said, please go tomorrow, Your Highness. Why do you insist on going right now? Is the sky falling down if we wait until tomorrow? Is it? Your health comes first. Look at the weather. Where on earth are you going? Just tell me. I'll summon them right away. Lady Giggs continued her relentless objections. However, the Empress pretended not to hear Lady Giggs's persistent protests. Your Highness, Empress. Only after Lady Giggs, with determination in her voice, almost shouted, did the Empress finally turn to look at her. The old lady's gaze was stern and unyielding. The Empress, convinced that persuasion through words was impossible, closed her eyes and smiled at the old lady. Empress said, just for a moment. Lady Giggs replied, Your Highness, why now of all times? Ah, hearing you raise your voice makes my head spin. As the Empress exaggeratedly held her head and pretended to be in distress. Lady Giggs, who had been about to scold her further, quickly examined her complexion. And then, with a hearty smile, she whispered to Lady Giggs, who was left speechless. I'll be back. The Empress took a step back and pointed to a waiting maid behind her. Follow me. Yes. Oh, yes. The maid quickly followed the Empress, darting out of the main gate at lightning speed as if she feared being caught by Lady Giggs. Watching the fading figures of the two women from afar, Lady Giggs let out a deep, long sigh and lowered her head. Defying Lady Gig's objections, the Empress headed towards the residence of the Magicians' Guild within the Imperial Palace. The charismatic wizard effortlessly took the lead, guiding her through the bustling crowd. Passers-by hurried to a halt, bowing respectfully as they crossed their path, and Adele responded with an air of casual grace as she strolled forward. Inside the opulent official residence, a world of grandeur awaited. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft, mesmerizing glow over ornate ceiling paintings, evoking the ambiance of an extravagant ballroom. Adele maintained an outwardly unimpressed demeanor, yet her eyes couldn't help but wander, taking in the splendor of her surroundings. She paused from time to time, scrutinizing the faces of those who greeted them, determined to etch them into her memory. As the Empress glided past, the assembled wizards respectfully raised their heads one by one. Among them stood Brunhild Alexa, a striking figure with fiery red hair and piercing crimson eyes. Her gaze followed the Empress's retreating form with an intensity that hinted at secrets hidden beneath the surface. At that moment, one of Brunhild's associates approached her, leaning in to whisper conspiratorially. "The Empress is due for public recognition, isn't she? Are you considering accepting her rank?" Brunhild sighed and replied, her thoughts wandering back to that day. Even Lennox Poitier had been uncharacteristically silent on that fateful occasion. Expecting a blood-soaked rose garden strewn with the bodies of her knights, she had been met with a surreal sight: a floating tower frozen in midair, emitting an otherworldly roar. After a time, a diminutive human spirit descended to the ground, leaving the crumbling tower behind. She single-handedly demolished the tower in a way no one had ever seen before. Brunhild remarked, her voice laced with sarcasm. She turned away, her mind racing as she took determined strides forward. What really matters, she mused to herself, is one's attitude toward the tower. A magician who was working at the entrance was taken aback and almost stumbled when he suddenly saw the Empress. Rumors had spread that the Empress had fallen, so he looked at her with widened eyes. Adelaide, as if ignoring his bewildered state, gazed into the interior of the guild and said, "I would like to meet the head of the Magicians' Guild. I have come without prior notice, so I'm not sure if he's here." He replied, "Oh, please come in, Your Majesty the Empress. The guildmaster is inside the residence." On the other hand, Duke d'Espun, who served as the head of the Magicians' Guild, received the news of the Empress's arrival with great enthusiasm. His smile, filled with warmth and familiarity, made it seem as though she was welcoming a long-lost family member after several years. "Your Majesty the Empress, you have come without prior notice. Please forgive the impoliteness." Empress replied, "Impoliteness? Please don't say that. How is your health?" "No, this isn't the time for that. Come this way. You have worked hard. Go." Adelaide entered Duke d'Espun's office along with her, and the opulent interior of the guild seemed to reflect the tastes of the Duke. Even the smallest decorations displayed appeared delicate and beautiful as if they were crafted by a skilled artisan. "The office is truly beautiful," Adelaide remarked. The Duke replied, "Ha ha ha, I have always loved beautiful things. Please, have a seat. Are you feeling well?" "Yes, I am," she replied. The Duke gestured for Adelaide to sit and then called for tea from her attendant. She said, "I came here hastily without any gifts." He continued, "No, please don't say that. Your Majesty the Empress gracing us with your presence is a great gift in itself." Shortly, the attendant brought the tea, and Adelaide took a sip lightly. After a few customary sips, then Duke spoke. "Did you come here because of what I mentioned earlier? Do you wish to become the owner of the tower?" "The owner of the tower? I do enjoy being the owner of something." The Empress smiled with the expression of a ruler, which suited her surprisingly well. "Yes, indeed, Your Majesty, you are already an owner. Shouldn't you try to control it here?" But seeing the Empress had crossed the ocean, she could make an educated guess about the situation in Gotrov. He said, "Yes, as you say, if you are with me, then yes, I will." The two of them exchanged warm smiles, gazing at each other with a sense of camaraderie. At the end of a momentary silence filled with laughter, he spoke. "First, would you like to receive acknowledgement from the guild?" She asked. "How do I receive acknowledgement?" He continued. "The acknowledgement in Egmont is done through a competition between magicians, which also determines the rankings. With your skills demonstrated in single-handedly destroying the tower." He raised an inquisitive look at Adelaide. "Would you be willing to challenge our deputy guildmaster?" "Oh, of course, you'd have to go to an area with magical influence since using magic is prohibited in the capital." Maintaining an appearance of kindness, the Duke gave Adelaide a sly look. Empress lowered her gaze as she spoke. "What does that even mean? Whether I receive acknowledgement or not, I am already a magician. I can't see the need to go through the trouble of receiving acknowledgement, unless it allows me to participate in the Council of Mages." Duke de Spun regarded the Empress sharply, not missing a beat. "What you said is right, Your Majesty. Whether you get acknowledgement or not, you are a magician. To be honest, receiving acknowledgement might not seem necessary unless it grants you access to the Council of Mages." Adele calmly lowered her gaze and raised her teacup, while the Duke of de Spun cast a sharp glance at the Empress. It would be quite troublesome if the Empress, holding hands with Balder, joined a ministerial meeting and started speaking nonsense. However, leaving the tower unattended without recruiting strong and capable talent was not an appealing option. Essentially, they should have a tool in hand, not stashed away in their pocket. At that moment, Adele, having set down her teacup, added a few words as if she had glimpsed into his thoughts. She then spoke. "Are you finding it challenging to include me, who has Lionel Balder as an assistant, in the Council of Ministers?" Duke de Spun. "As Duke suggested, aren't we practically family now?" The Empress bestowed a friendly smile upon the Duke of de Spun, who, in turn, clenched his teeth while looking across the sea at the Empress Dowager. He thought, "They say she's a naive and discreet princess. But Empress Gotrov has sent quite a formidable force." Having swiftly concluded his calculations, the Duke continued to wear a very amicable smile. He continued, "Yes, no matter what others might say, we are indeed family now. Regarding the Central Council meeting, I will personally speak to His Majesty the Emperor. However, she repeated. The Duke's smile vanished as if it were a mere facade. He bore a striking resemblance to the Emperor. He continued, "After receiving formal recognition, giving gold bars to Count Calvin, it would be advisable to refrain from such actions as much as possible. Only then can you truly assert ownership over the tower. Otherwise, the Duke could easily undermine her authority whenever he pleased." He possessed that level of power. For now, the Duke of de Spun has decided to weigh her position as the Empress. Adele responded with a smile, her lips curling. She then spoke. "Of course, but I've heard there are countless estates where towers have been constructed. How do you intend to manage them?" He continued. "I've heard that Gotrov dismantles the towers systematically. It may be a more effective method of destroying the towers than Egmont, but we don't know much about the properties of the towers." Adele focused intently on his words, and the Duke of Despondent spoke with a secretive smile as if sharing a confidential tidbit. "Your Majesty, the tower calls out to the tower, and the tower absorbs the tower." It was a peculiar statement, and he elaborated. "When all that I have planned has come to fruition, wizards will finally be able to harness their full power. The era of wizards has now dawned. On that day, those who are not wizards will become second-class citizens." Images of the houses in the slum, resembling coffins in a graveyard, flashed through Adele's mind. She clenched her fists tightly, concealed under the table. The Duke of de Spun was engaging in a perilous gamble with the lives of countless people. Her golden eyes, which had gleamed with warmth and charm just moments ago, turned icy as she elegantly turned away. The corners of her lips, which had been upturned in a smile, now subtly drooped. After finished chatting with Duke, Empress was on the way to her palace. As Adele took a step forward, the smile that had adorned her lips faded just as smoothly. Adele moved with a demeanor entirely different. As she recalled the Duke's taunting words about becoming the mistress of the tower and his face resurfaced in her mind, cold sweat broke out on her back. It wasn't fear but rather a visceral aversion. The greedy glint in his eyes, the selfishness that would stop at nothing for personal gain. Adele felt an instinctual revulsion toward such qualities. "Your Majesty, are you feeling unwell?" A maid, following closely behind, asked with concern, her eyes fixed on Adele's pale face. "I'm fine. Let's continue," Adele replied, dismissing the maid's worries. Setting aside the maid's concern, Adele quickened her pace. "Lady Giggs will throw a fit if she sees you like this. I told you not to go." The handmaiden, watching the Empress grow paler by the moment, hurried to catch up. "Your Majesty." Suddenly, a deep voice echoed in their ears, causing both the handmaiden and the Empress to stop in their tracks. They simultaneously turned their heads in the direction from which the voice had come. There stood a man in black attire, silhouetted against the sun. The unexpected encounter brought a smile to the Empress's face. Lionel. News of the Empress waking up had been haunting Lionel incessantly, threatening to drive him mad. He had tried his best to quell the tumultuous emotions, but instead of subsiding. How long had he walked? He suddenly realized where this path led and came to a halt. He wasn't some teenage boy suffering from the fever of first love. I must be crazy. It felt as if he had become a wild beast, ready to turn back, mumbling to himself. He asked, "Your Majesty, are you feeling unwell?" The familiar voice brushed against his ear. "I'm fine." At the sound of the familiar voice, Lionel froze in his tracks, still facing away. The moment he heard that voice, surprisingly, all the turmoil that had been consuming him vanished like a flood receding. Lionel followed her with his eyes, as if drawn by an invisible force. Her jet black hair fluttered in the wind, revealing a side profile as white as snow. Her expressionless face was not just pale but almost translucent, and her closed lips lacked any hint of color. "Your Majesty." The one calling out to her wasn't his rational self. The sunlight streaming behind him made Adele squint slightly. "Lionel." Lionel approached her. The pouring sunlight gradually concealed his broad shoulders. As he stood in front of her, Lionel's shadow swallowed Adele. He glanced at her complexion and noticed the beads of sweat on her forehead. He asked, "It seems you haven't fully recovered yet. Please return to the palace quickly." It was like this even before. The Empress didn't have anything to cover herself with. Without hesitation, Lionel removed his conquest jacket. "What are you doing?" Adele asked in surprise as Lionel suddenly took off his jacket. He said, "If you expose yourself to the cold wind with cold sweat on your skin, you will surely catch a cold." She asked, "So you want me to wear that?" "Just wear it until we reach the palace," Lionel calmly said, and Adele looked at him with a bewildered expression. He suddenly remembered how she used to whisper her name and lower her voice. As he offered the jacket to the maid, who accepted it quickly and draped it over Adele's shoulders, Adele seemed like she had to put something on. When the large, sturdy jacket enveloped her shoulders, Adele could feel Lionel's body heat still lingering on it. It felt as if someone had embraced her from behind. Adele couldn't help but notice how big Lionel's physique was. Even with her shoulders wrapped by the jacket, there was plenty of space left, and it covered her thighs. She blinked for no apparent reason. Adele started walking again, and Lionel matched her stride. Adele looked at him for no reason. The sunlight shone through his shirt, which was covered by the jacket, and his firm silhouette was faintly visible. "Are you not feeling cold?" "I'm fine." A cool breeze swept between the two of them. Lionel quietly watched the direction the wind was blowing. Until then, he had been standing where the sunlight was pouring, so Adele was now bathed in sunlight. Adele looked at Lionel, who had shielded her from the wind, and couldn't help but smile. She then spoke. "By standing in wind direction and having someone block the wind for me, you're the only one in both Gotrov and Egmont who does that for me. You really are an excellent aide." Upon hearing her words, Lionel cleared his throat awkwardly. With the warm jacket, the sun, and now a reliable windbreaker, Adele's body, which had been shivering, began to warm up gradually. Her stiff forehead had also softened without her realizing it. She continued, "I'm sorry for making that strange request that day about bringing those people from Gotrov. Should I send people?" Since she had asked him to fetch them as if it were a matter of life and death. Lionel was determined to send people to Gotrov if she allowed it. However, at the same time, he had a subversive thought that he hoped she wouldn't call for them. He gazed at Adele's face as they walked. After walking in silence for a while, Adele finally raised her head slowly. "There's no need for that. It's fine," she said. With that, silence settled between the two. In the clear and bright autumn weather, Adele simply walked, absorbing Lionel's warmth as part of the sunshine. The road seemed long yet short. Eventually, they arrived at the palace. Adele, who had arrived first, lightly laughed and returned the jacket draped over her shoulders. She spoke. "Thank you. Thanks to you, I'm warm now. Would you like to come in and have some refreshments? Your Majesty should rest." "I will take my leave," he replied. In response to his loyal reply, Adele chuckled and turned around. Lady Giggs, who had rushed out anxiously, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and led her into the palace. Lionel watched Adele go inside and then put on his clothes again. As the lingering warmth from the jacket penetrated his body, he stood still and savored it. Meanwhile, at the Gotrov Imperial Palace, following the customs of mourning for the late emperor, the palace had been vacant for an extended period. However, the Emperor of Gotrov, who had grown unusually fast from a young age, was only 14 years old this year, yet he was taller than most adults, and his unique presence made him seem far from a typical adolescent. With jet black hair and striking golden eyes, his name was Lucio Gotrov. He was Adelaide's younger brother and the current emperor of the Gotrovian Empire. Shortly before arriving at the palace, the emperor received shocking news. "Adele, sister, it couldn't be." The emperor stormed forward, finally breaking into a run as he raced up the stairs. He reached the door to the room Adelaide used, but instead of bursting in, he closed his eyes and took a calm breath. The neatly arranged room held no warmth from recent occupancy. In fact, this room had often been empty more than it had been occupied, but the feeling was different now. He asked, "When did my sister leave?" The maid who approached the emperor with a growling question finally spoke. "When His Majesty left for his father's funeral," he said. "Then, before I left, she already knew about her marriage, didn't she?" "Yes," she replied. He spoke, even knowing that, "She didn't say a word to me." "Nanny, you must have known too. If you knew, you should have told me," the emperor shouted as if in anguish. The nanny replied, "Her Highness the Princess has requested your presence." In Gotrov, marriage was arranged by the parents. Regardless of Lucio's status as emperor, Adelaide's marriage was under the jurisdiction of her mother, the Empress Dowager, making it difficult for him to interfere. Moreover, the Empress Dowager is currently regent. But if he had only been determined, there could have been ways around it, but his sister had prevented it. The emperor's shoulders slumped as if all his strength had left him, and even a hint of betrayal seemed to emanate from him. The nanny, seeing the emperor in such a state, reached into her bosom and handed him a letter. "Her Highness left a letter for you." The emperor, who had been extending his arm, swiftly took the letter like a lightning bolt. After dismissing everyone from the room except the nanny, he impatiently tore open the envelope. There was only one sheet inside. The firm, unadorned script and the concise sentences, devoid of any sentiment, were characteristic of her. His golden eyes quickly read the words, and his hand holding the letter began to tremble uncontrollably. Eventually, the emperor buried his face in the letter. "Your Majesty," she addressed me. "Ask your Majesty. My sister is truly a fool." The emperor wept as he read his sister's letter. "Your sister, she's truly a fool." It was a letter of apology. Lucio, the emperor, headed straight for the Empress Dowager's palace after leaving Adelaide's residence. The Empress Dowager had already prepared to receive him upon hearing that the Emperor had arrived. "Welcome, Your Majesty." With a beautiful face, she greeted him warmly as if she were showing compassion, her demeanor reminiscent of his mother's. He asked, "Why did you send my sister to Emont without consulting me?" The Empress Dowager had anticipated this question. She responded with a gentle tone and a prepared answer. "Adelaide is not meant to be a mere noblewoman. Being the Empress of Emont is better than that. I'm sorry I couldn't inform you earlier. But isn't that true for Adelaide as well?" At that, Lucio chuckled. At his son's sudden laughter, the Empress Dowager was momentarily speechless. He continued, "Do you think I wouldn't know what you were using to pressure my sister?" Her eyes widened as she stared at the Emperor. The Emperor, with a subdued sigh, leaned toward the Empress Dowager. "Mother, Adelaide's creation of the Tower Countermeasures Division has become an obstacle to the strengthening of imperial authority. When you become emperor someday, you must suppress the power of that wicked thing. Do you understand?" Even as a young child, Lucio found that statement rather odd. In his eyes, his sister, who roamed the wilderness in robes rather than sitting in the palace adorned with extravagant clothing, seemed more impressive than their mother. With a face that seemed almost wild, she knelt on one knee, looking at him like a towering mountain. When he met her exquisite golden eyes, he couldn't help but feel proud of his own eye color, which resembled hers. "Sister, can't you send someone else on the expedition and stay in the palace?" Whining childishly, he looked at her, and his sister always smiled affectionately in response. It was their mother who had forced this extraordinary and admirable sister to step aside from her position as crown princess. Their mother had demanded power that was truly cruel and merciless, even sending her own daughter into exile in a foreign land. Adele always apologized to Lucio. When asked what she was sorry for, she would just smile and not provide an answer. She believed her younger sibling remained unaware of the incident until now, so she finally left behind a letter of apology. However, Lucio had already discovered the truth several years ago. Lucio was born the year Adelaide turned 10. At that time, Adelaide was a crown princess, and Lucio received the title of prince. But when she turned 14, Adelaide defied her mother and established the Tower Resistance headquarters. The current Empress, who was then the Queen, acknowledged the Tower Resistance headquarters but also made this claim: "The succession of a kingdom should prioritize one's safety above all else." The princess who declares that she will navigate through the political arena by establishing the Tower Resistance headquarters should delegate her position to Lucio Gotrov and leave the tower. The Emperor supported Adelaide, but the winner of this battle was the Empress. Adelaide relinquished her position as princess, but it wasn't easy for her to accept. Surrendering that position felt like a death sentence for someone who had always lived as a princess. However, she couldn't give up on the Tower Resistance headquarters. Some of her followers made a cruel proposition to her. It was an offer solely for her benefit, yet it was also something she shouldn't accept. Eliminate Prince Lucio. Normally, Adelaide would have unhesitatingly rejected such an inhumane proposal. But backed into a corner, she found herself wavering for a moment. Ultimately, she rejected the proposal, but the courtiers noticed her momentary hesitation. Adelaide's relinquishment of her princess position was a painful event for those who had supported her wholeheartedly. How could they watch their ship sink? Some of Adelaide's most extreme followers resorted to desperate measures. They secretly laced a potent poison into the 4-year-old prince's snack. Adelaide rushed frantically to save Lucio, who held the poisoned snack in his hand, and then held her younger brother close, crying endlessly. The momentary weakness that had shaken her had turned into poison for her beloved sibling. The late emperor arrested all those involved in this incident, but no records were left indicating that they were Adelaide's followers. As the blood of those who had once supported Adelaide flowed freely and the acrid smoke from burning bodies covered the sky, Adelaide realized that as long as she remained in Gotrov, such incidents would repeat themselves sooner or later. "I'm sorry, Lucio, please forgive the momentary weakness I showed. And now, after more than a decade, Adelaide finally wrote a letter to Lucio, confessing everything to him. Perhaps going to Egmont was her self-imposed punishment and a final act of consideration for her brother. So she must have accepted the turmoil akin to exile with resignation. Did you threaten my sister, mother? The emperor growled as he asked, and the empress responded with a cold, piercing gaze. Empress spoke. Do you think Adelaide would simply obey such threats and leave? Who do you think my daughter is? Lucio faltered at the empress's acerbic words. Her compassionate smile had disappeared, and her face, as she looked at her son, had transformed into that of a ruthless politician. She left of her own accord. That can't be true. Lucio vehemently denied it, but the empress patiently explained. Emperor, there cannot be two suns in the sky. There can only be one. Despite her failure, why do you think Adelaide's followers tried to kill you that day? Just her existence alone is like a sword hanging over your neck. Are you saying that my sister's presence would lead to my demise? Then Empress replied, it's not just a matter between the two of you. Adelaide's child, who will be older than your child, will have an impact on your successor. Wait for 10 years, and you will be grateful to this mother. Back in his palace, the emperor ordered Cain Knox, who had followed him, gather a few trustworthy individuals and go to Egmont. Find out how Adelaide is doing. If my sister is unhappy there. If she no longer wishes to stay there. The emperor's golden eyes gleamed with clarity. Bring my sister back to Gotrov. I am willing to wage war for that cause if necessary. Cain Knox bowed his head and replied, Yes, your majesty. On the other hand, following Diane's orders, Lorraine headed towards the emperor's study. She couldn't help but worry about what would happen if the emperor wasn't there, but that was a mere thought. The emperor, without a word, didn't even look at Lorraine as she entered. What's the matter? His voice was dry, and devoid of emotion. As rumored in public, there was no doubt that the emperor's interest in and affection for Diane were gradually fading. It wasn't so much that he despised or disliked her, but rather that he was growing indifferent. Lorraine cautiously assessed the emperor's mood before speaking. She spoke, The lady of Count Portier has requested an audience with your majesty. At her words, Karl furrowed his brow. He asked, Why didn't she come in person? Why did she send you? She replied, Because her majesty is not feeling well today. Coming in person would have been too much of a burden. Karl raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, his expression uninterested. I'll go later, he said dismissively. She continued, Forgive me, your majesty. Lady Portier has something urgent to convey and has requested your presence immediately. The emperor's hand, which had been about to sign a document, froze in midair. He asked, Right now? Yes, your majesty. I apologize for the inconvenience. She replied. Lorraine reached the entrance to Diana's chambers and promptly knocked on the door. His Majesty, the Emperor has arrived. Karl entered the room without hesitation. Your Majesty. At Diana's frail voice, Karl let out an involuntary sigh. The voice now seemed irritating rather than sympathetic. He preferred the strength that he could break rather than the vulnerability that worried him. Karl slowly turned his head to look at Diana, and he chuckled. Silence hung in the air. Something was subtly different. Puzzled by the strange discomfort, Karl paused, and that's when Diane slowly extended her hand toward him. Your Majesty, come here, please. Karl reacted to her gesture. Her complexion pale as if to confirm her claim of poor health. You mentioned you weren't feeling well. Are you feeling any better? Instead of answering his question, Diane cautiously took Karl's hand. Although the royal physicians had not yet provided a clear diagnosis, Diane couldn't wait any longer. She was convinced that there was a child in her womb. Even if the official announcement had to be delayed, she wanted Karl to know at the very least. Diana gently guided Karl's hand to her belly. In that moment, Karl froze. He stared at his hand on Diana's abdomen with a rigid expression. Your Majesty, there might be our child here. Silence continued to envelop them. Diane gazed at the Emperor's hand resting on her belly with tears of joy in her eyes. My child, your father is the Emperor of the realm. Her whole body trembled with happiness, and tears welled up in her eyes, streaming down her cheeks. Diane wiped away her tears and continued, all the recent discomfort I've been feeling corresponds to early pregnancy symptoms. However, as she spoke, she suddenly realized that the Emperor was silent. She slowly raised her head, and in that instant, she almost screamed. His eyes met hers, and she forgot to breathe. Instead of the warm gaze she had expected on her belly, the Emperor was looking at her as if he could see through her. When their eyes met, a shockingly cold gaze and expression met her, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Your Majesty, even as Diane called out to him, her voice trembled with uncertainty, but the Emperor remained silent. Slowly, he withdrew his hands from Diane's stomach. His demeanor was so indifferent that Diane couldn't help but feel like she had made a grave mistake. Our story ends, my dear friends. Thanks for watching. Please comment and like our video. This will help us.